Hey everyone, welcome to Your Learn Lab. I'm Seema, and if you're an IGNOU student, you're in the right place. Here we create videos on different IGNOU courses to help you ace your exams. So hit subscribe and join me on this learning journey. Welcome to MEG 1, IGNOU's British Poetry series. In today's video, we are going to cover the Age of Chaucer, Part 1, Historical and Cultural Background. To gain a deeper understanding of the historical and social background that's essential to understanding Chaucer's themes, characters, and style. Studying the age would equip you to better interpret his satire, his realism, and his moral vision, all of which are shaped by the 14th century context. Understanding the historical context of a poem would help you grasp the poet's intent, themes, and tones more deeply. It reveals the social, political, and cultural influences behind the work, allowing for a richer and more accurate interpretation. In the exams, it also strengthens the literary analysis and critical insight. So let's begin with a quick look at what we are covering today. To truly understand Chaucer's writing, we need to first understand the world he lived in. So this session is all about the setting of that stage. We'll start with some of the key historical events like Hundred Years' War and the Black Death and the Peasants' Revolt that disrupted and shaped medieval society. Then we'll look at major social changes, how feudalism gave way to a more mobile urban class structure, and how guilds and cities began to rise in importance. Then we'll look more closely at the cultural framework Chaucer used to portray people in his stories, including the structure of the three estates, the ideals and contradictions of chivalry, the fantasy of courtly love, and how all of this plays out in the story of Troilus and Cresside. By the end of this video, you'll have a strong understanding of the world Chaucer was writing in and how that world shaped the characters, conflicts, and voices in his work. We are sticking to the IGNOU material for the flow and content references, so let's start with the historical background. To truly understand Chaucer's poetry, especially the Canterbury Tales, we need to see it within the historical world he lived in. 14th century England. This was a time of huge transition. England was moving away from the old feudal rural system and becoming more commercial and urban. People were no longer just tied to the land and their lords. Instead, trade and towns were growing, and this brought new opportunities, especially for the middle class. Unlike France, where feudalism remained strong for longer, England began to change earlier. One of the biggest drivers of this change was the wool trade, which made some towns and merchants very rich. To support this, farmland was turned into pasture, which meant fewer people were needed to work the land. So, what happened to all those rural laborers? Many of them moved to towns in search of work. There, they joined merchant and craft guilds, forming a new rising class that didn't belong neatly to the old feudal structure. Chaucer, who lived and worked in London, the heart of this new economy, was very much a part of this changing world. He wasn't a nobleman or a farmer. He was an urban poet, and his writing reflects the energy, complexity, and contradictions of this period. In the Canterbury Tales, you'll see not just knights and monks, but also merchants, tradesmen, clerks, and ordinary workers. These characters represent the new social landscape of England. People trying to find their place in a world that was no longer ruled only by land and birth, but also by money, mobility, and ambition. Now that we've seen how England was already shifting from a feudal to a more urban and commercial society, let's quickly look at three major historical events that accelerated this transformation. Each of these events had a deep and lasting impact on how people lived, worked, and thought, and they all happened during Chaucer's lifetime. The Hundred Years' War reshaped political power and national identity. The Black Death caused a massive population loss and changed labor dynamics, and the Peasants' Revolt revealed growing resistance to inequality and feudal oppression. These events didn't just affect kings and nobles. They changed the lives of ordinary people, and Chaucer, living through this period, reflected many of these tensions in his writing. We'll now look at each of these events in more detail, starting with the Hundred Years' War. Let's deep dive into the Hundred Years' War. The Hundred Years' War, though stretched over more than a century, was really a series of connected conflicts between England and France. At the core of it was one main issue: who had the rightful claim to the French throne. It began in 1337 when the French king died without a direct male heir. Edward III of England, whose mother was a sister of the dead king, claimed that he had the strongest right to succeed. But the French crown Philip VI instead argued that the throne couldn't pass through the female line. That rejection, combined with the long standing tensions over English controlled territories in France like Aquitaine and rivalry in trade, especially with Flanders, pushed Edward to war. Now let's take a look at the different phases of the war. The first one is the Edwardian War from 1337 to 1360. This first phase saw Edward III take his claim to the battlefield. He led major campaigns in France, determined to prove both his legitimacy and England's strength. The English won decisive victories, most famously at Crécy and Poitiers, thanks in part to their skilled longbowmen. At Poitiers, they even captured the French king. The war brought England to the height of its power on French soil. By 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny was signed, recognizing Edward's control over large parts of France. At this point, it looked like Edward's claim might actually succeed. Let's move on to the next phase, which is the Caroline War, 1369 to 1389. Now, Edward's control did not last. Once Charles V of France came to power, the French rejected the treaty and began reclaiming their lost lands. Charles used a more careful strategy. He avoided direct battles and instead focused on sieges and slow recovery. England's earlier strength began to fade. Edward III was aging, his son, the Black Prince, was ill, and internal divisions made it harder for England to hold its ground. This phase wasn't just about reclaiming land, it was France's response to England's claim to power and a turning point in restoring French control. Now we move on to the third phase, the Lancastrian War from 1415 to 1453. The conflict reignited when Henry V of England renewed the claim. He was ambitious and charismatic and in 1415 led an invasion of France. His victory at Agincourt was massive, another moment where English military power seemed unstoppable. Henry even forced a treaty that named him heir to the French throne. But after Henry's death, things changed quickly. The French cause gained new energy from Joan of Arc, a young peasant girl who believed she was divinely chosen to save France. Her leadership inspired the French to rally and they began pushing the English out. By 1453, England had lost nearly all of its French territories except Calais, and the dream of uniting the two crowns had vanished. So, across all three phases, the motivation remained the same: a battle over who would rule France, tangled with control of land and trade, and driven by shifting power of leadership on both sides. The war shaped the politics, economy, and society of Chaucer's time, and its effects are echoed in the way Chaucer writes about power, class, and social change. The Hundred Years' War had a big impact on both England and France, not just on kings and armies, but on ordinary people and how society was structured. For England, some of the early victories gave people a stronger sense of national identity. The war also changed the way battles were fought. Instead of relying on noble knights, armies started depending on more common soldiers, especially the archers and footmen. This shift gave more importance to ordinary people in warfare. Because war is expensive, the English monarchy had to ask Parliament for money again and again. Over time, this made Parliament more powerful, and it was a step towards a more representative form of the government. The old ideas of chivalry like noble behavior, loyalty, and honor in battle, they started to break down. Even Shakespeare, writing centuries later, showed in plays like Henry V how common soldiers, not just nobles, became the real heroes of war. Economically, both countries suffered a lot. France's countryside was ruined by battles and looting, and both nations were left with huge financial problems. Chaucer lived during this time of major change. Through his travels with royal missions and what he might have seen in France, he likely witnessed the harsh realities of war. His sympathy for the poor and powerless show up in many of his characters. So, the 100 Years' War wasn't just about two kings fighting. It helped bring about the decline of feudalism, the rise of national identity, and even helped set the stage for the Renaissance. For Chaucer, it gave him rich material to explore themes like class, power, and social change in his poetry. Let's now move on to the next most catastrophic and transformative events of Chaucer's century, the Black Death, which struck England in 1348 to 49. It didn't begin with war or politics, but with rats, specifically black rats on trading ships that docked in English ports. Unseen, the fleas on those rats carried the bubonic plague, and once they reached land, the disease spread fast. One infected person could pass it on to dozens, and in the crowded, unsanitary towns of the 14th century England, the plague tore through the population at terrifying speed. It's estimated that around one-third of the population died. Some regions lost even more. Imagine the scale: entire families gone within days, whole villages abandoned. The dead were buried in mass graves, the living were terrified and confused. There were no clear explanations, only fear, superstition, and desperation. But as devastating as it was, the Black Death also changed the structure of society, especially for the working poor. With so many people gone, there were very few workers to farm the land, build houses, or run shops. Yet the demand for labor remained the same. Suddenly, workers, especially peasants, found themselves in a rare position. They could ask for more pay or leave a manor for a better offer elsewhere. Many moved to towns seeking wage work, independence, and a different life. This shift weakened the feudal system. Lords desperate for labor had to offer better terms. Some peasants became freeholders able to rent or own land on their own terms. And even the clergy, also reduced in number by the plague, began to support the idea of fairer wages, something unthinkable a generation earlier. In just a few years, the plague had done what centuries of resistance had failed to do. It unsettled the old order. For Chaucer, living in this world of transition, the effects were all around him. He saw a society where traditional hierarchies were being questioned, where working people had new leverage, and where social roles were in flux. That's why the Canterbury Tales include such a range of characters: nobles, craftsmen, clergy, and laborers, all jostling for space and speaking with their own voices. The Black Death didn't just empty villages, it reshaped England economically, socially, and morally. And that shift is part of the very texture of Chaucer's writing. Now, after the chaos and devastation of the Black Death, something interesting happened in England, especially under King Edward III. In a time when the country was shaken by loss and instability, Edward revived the idea of chivalry, the medieval code of honor, loyalty, and knightly behavior. In 1348, the same year the plague reached England, he founded the Order of the Garter, a highly prestigious group of knights. This order wasn't just symbolic. It was meant to bring back the values of noble conduct, especially during a time when the world seemed out of control. The idea of chivalry became a kind of anchor, a symbol of tradition and order in a society that had been turned upside down. It later inspired other knightly orders across Europe. But while these ideals looked backward to a noble past, England itself was changing rapidly, especially in the cities. Towns were growing, and the biggest example was London. Compared to major cities on the continent, most English towns were still small, usually about 3,000 to 4,000 people, but they were expanding. These towns were surrounded by walls for protection, especially since there were no police at the time. Inside the walls, life was busy and competitive. Towns were mostly controlled by merchant and craft guilds. Merchant guilds were powerful. They controlled trade and had a lot of influence over town affairs. Craft guilds, on the other hand, represented skilled workers like weavers, bakers, or blacksmiths. These guilds didn't just manage trades. They competed with each other and were known for organizing feast day processions, performances, and charity events. Town life was colorful and energetic. And this was a world Geoffrey Chaucer lived in. Chaucer spent much of his life in London, a city that had grown to around 40,000 people, huge by medieval standards. The streets were lined with taverns, markets, churches, and houses that were simple, often with wooden shutters and open ground floors. At night, the streets were dangerous. There were no lights and crime was common. But during the day, the city was alive with all kinds of activity: royal procession, public announcements, disputes, sales, even pageants and plays. The Tabard Inn, where the Canterbury Tales begin, was one of the many such inns in Southwark, a lively part of the town outside the city walls. Chaucer's writing captures all this. He doesn't just describe noble knights and rich merchants, he includes a whole cross section of the society: cooks, clerics, poor scholars, even cheats and swindlers. His stories show how both the energy and the inequality of the city life thrive. In a way, his London is a character itself, full of noise, ambition, religion, corruption, and humor. So, even though England was still shaped by old ideas like chivalry, it was also becoming something new. Chaucer stood right at that intersection, and the Canterbury Tales reflects a world of tradition and transformation happening side by side. Finally, we have the last key event, the Peasants' Revolt. In 1381, England saw one of the most explosive social uprisings, the Peasants' Revolt. It didn't come out of nowhere. For years, ordinary people, especially peasants and laborers, had been dealing with heavy taxes, low wages, and strict feudal rules that limited their freedom. The Black Death had already shaken society, and now, with the country still recovering, the government introduced poll tax, a flat fee every adult had to pay to help fund military campaigns. This tax was deeply unfair, especially to the poor, and it pushed people over the edge. A man named Wat Taylor became the leader of the rebellion. Along with thousands of others, he marched into London demanding an end to the tax and the feudal oppression they'd lived under for centuries. The rebels stormed government buildings, killed royal officials, and made it clear they wanted justice, rights, and change. At first, King Richard II, who was only 14 at the time, seemed to listen. He met the rebels and made promises to address their demands. But as soon as the immediate danger passed, the promises were broken. The uprising was violently crushed, and Wat Tyler was killed. Even though it failed, the revolt was a turning point. It was one of the first mass protests in English history, and it showed that ordinary people were becoming more aware of their rights and more willing to fight for them. Chaucer doesn't write directly about the revolt, but the tensions of this era are present in the Canterbury Tales. Characters like the Reeve, a former carpenter turned estate manager, and the miller, a bold and rowdy figure, reflect a world where working people had begun to challenge old hierarchies. Through satire, humor, and sharp observation, Chaucer captures a society in the midst of change where questions of class, authority, and voice were becoming louder. Now that we've explored the three major events that reshaped the 14th century English society, the Hundred Years' War, the Black Death, and the Peasants' Revolt, we move on to the final key aspect of this period: the changing cultural and intellectual climate and how it influenced Chaucer's view of society. This isn't about big historical events. It's about how people thought, lived, worked, and related to one another. And Chaucer, through his poetry, gives us a window into that world. Let's now take a look at Chaucer's view of society, which he presents through the well-known medieval concept of the three estates. In medieval thought, society was divided into three broad groups or estates. First, the knight, representing the nobility whose job was to fight and protect. Second, the ecclesiastic, that is, members of the church like monks, friars, and priests, responsible for spiritual guidance. And third, the working class people who labored, farmed, or engaged in trade. This model was not just social, it was seen as God ordained, part of the natural order of the world. Now, what's interesting is how Chaucer uses this structure and also challenges it. In the Canterbury Tales, he focuses largely on these three estates but leaves out two extremes: the high aristocracy and the serfs. Instead, he turns his attention to the rising middle class, what we call the bourgeois perspective. This shift is significant. By highlighting characters like merchants, clerks, and guildsmen, Chaucer offers us a view of society through the eyes of those who were gaining economic power and social mobility in towns and cities. These weren't nobles, but they weren't peasants either. They were in between, ambitious, visible, and increasingly influential. At the same time, Chaucer doesn't idealize this new class. His treatment is full of irony and critique. He observes their behaviors very carefully, often exposing contradictions between how they present themselves and how they actually act. Through humor, subtle commentary, and character flaws, Chaucer critiques the values and the moral inconsistencies of this emerging class. So, Chaucer gives us more than just a social cross section. He gives us a thoughtful, sometimes skeptical look at a society in transition. His portrayal is both rooted in the traditional structure of the three estates and reflective of the shifting dynamics of his time. This is important for exams, guys, because it helps you show how Chaucer reflects and critiques the social changes of his time through structure, the characters that he uses, and of course the tone. Let's now take a closer look at chivalry, not just what it was supposed to be, but also what it became. Originally, chivalry was a code of conduct for knights. It emphasized values like strength, charity, and faith, with the knight expected to protect the weak and serve with honor. During the First Crusade in 1095, Pope Urban II urged knights to adopt these Christian ideals, turning warfare into something that was meant to be spiritually meaningful. But over time, these ideals began to lose their grounding. By the 12th century, actual warfare was being replaced by tournaments and jousting. Public spectacles more focused on fame and entertainment than real combat. Chivalry became more of a display than a duty. There was also a growing disconnect between what knights were supposed to represent and what they actually did. During the Hundred Years' War, many knights enriched themselves through looting and ransom. Titles of knighthood were no longer earned only on the battlefield. Wealthy merchants could now purchase them, which weakened the link between knighthood and noble conduct. At the same time, feudal society remained deeply unequal. While chivalry preached protection and justice, serfs who made up most of the population had little freedom or security. This exposed the contradiction between ideal image of the knight and the harsh realities of social life. Chaucer was aware of this contradiction. In the Canterbury Tales, he doesn't openly attack the idea of chivalry, but he does hint at the gap between appearance and reality, often through irony and character flaws. For your exams, remember that Chaucer's world was one where chivalric ideals still existed, but were often undermined by personal ambition, inequality, and economic change. Let's now look at another major tension in Chaucer's world, the gap between ideal of courtly love and the reality of marriage in medieval society. In literature, courtly love was often presented as something pure, noble, and chaste. A knight would admire a lady from afar, pledging loyalty and performing noble deeds in her honor. This love was supposed to be spiritual, not physical, almost like worshipping the idea of love itself. But in reality, marriage during the Middle Ages had little to do with love. Most marriages, especially among the upper classes, were arranged for economic or social reasons. Property, alliances, and inheritance came first. Personal choices or affection rarely mattered. This led to serious contradictions. For example, child marriages were common, and women had very limited rights. A woman often needed a husband simply to inherit or defend property, and many were trapped in marriages where they had little control over their lives. The courtly ideal of women as noble and revered was often far removed from how women were actually treated in daily life. There's also an issue of illicit love. Because real marriages were often so cold or transactional, secrecy, affairs, and even abuse were common themes in medieval literature. Ironically, the tradition of courtly love sometimes ended up celebrating these affairs as long as they were passionate and idealized. Chaucer was very aware of this gap between love as an ideal and marriage as a reality. In Canterbury Tales, he doesn't just describe love, he critiques the social and gender dynamics behind it. Through characters like the wife of Bath or the merchant's tale, he shows how love, marriage, power, and hypocrisy often collided in the lives of real people. To understand how Chaucer explores the tension between courtly love and real life social norms, let's take a closer look at his poem Troilus and Cressida. The story is set during the Trojan War and follows Troilus, a Trojan prince who falls deeply in love with Cressida, the daughter of a traitor. Their love, though passionate and sincere, has to remain a secret because if it became public, it would lead to pressure to marry, and that brings with it a whole set of social and political complications. This secrecy is not just about protecting their relationship, it's a reflection of the societal expectations of the time. In medieval society, love might be idealized in poetry, but in real life, relationships were bound by rules, reputation, and consequences. Public recognition often meant obligation, especially for women. So here, Chaucer isn't telling a tragic love story, he's also showing us the gap between romantic ideals and reality. While courtly love celebrates devotion and emotional connection, the real world is shaped by duty, marriage contracts, and social judgment. In that sense, Troilus and Cressida become a case study of contradiction. A love that tries to remain pure and private in a world where love is rarely free. So, to recap, we've looked at the major historical and cultural focus that shaped Chaucer's world. From the political upheavals of the Hundred Years' War to the social restructuring caused by Black Death and the rising voices of the working class in the Peasants' Revolt, we've seen how these events disrupted the old feudal order and created space for new kinds of people and perspectives to emerge. We also explored how urban growth, guild culture, and changing class structures found their way into Chaucer's poetry, especially in the way he portrayed a wide range of characters with honesty, irony, and depth. Chaucer lived in a world of transition and contradiction, and his poetry captures that tension brilliantly. In the next video, we'll move from the historical and cultural background to the intellectual and philosophical context of Chaucer's time, exploring how ideas about religion, science, the cosmos, and the human body influenced the literature of the 14th century. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for joining. All the best for your IGNOU MEG 1 exam. If you found this video helpful and would like to learn more, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to Your Learn Lab. See you in the next one. Until then, happy learning.